welcome to Shiloh Ranch and all that means. I feel like that this week we're kind of rolling into what would be not the season premiere necessarily, but sort of like we're getting rolling right back into the season of church. If you don't know, the way that church seasons work is it runs like from September through March. You know, it's not the January 1st to December 1st year that we're all used to. And here's what's going on in the world. Now, you might be watching this a year from now. You might be watching this 6 months from now. You might be watching it right now. But I just want to let you know that as this is being recorded, Oregon is in the middle of one of the most devastating summers it's ever experienced. There's fires. Portland. What else can you say there? We're in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic, and what does that mean? And you're like, wow, this really started off cheery. Let me just clarify that right now, as we're going into this sort of new season of the church, as we're coming back, as people are kind of coming back from doing the stuff that they're doing, just understand we are walking into a room where things have been tipped over. You know, it's like walking in on the scene of a robbery, and we're trying to process everything that we're seeing as a nation and in our state. The fact that we would even consider, and by the time you watch this, maybe this will all come out in the wash, whether these fires have anything to do with arson or not, whether they do or whether they don't, the fact that we're even talking about that tells you that as a people, as a nation, like as a state, we've lost our way. In this season right now, I feel the weight of preaching to a people who, as a nation, we've lost our way. And if we're being honest, I think that we would all collectively say, like, this isn't worth it. This is not worth it. Like, whatever it takes, let's just, how many times I just wish it was back to normal again. It's not worth it. I want to go back. And there is a desperation that sort of comes to the surface. We're like, I want to go back, but there's no back to go to. I think of like refugees fleeing their country, and they say, you know, I wish I could go back, but what I mean by that is 10 years ago. I don't mean a location or a spot on the map. And I feel like that as a country, we're sort of realizing that back isn't there anymore. And there's nothing worse than saying these words, like, it's not worth it, but you can't quit. That's kind of a hopeless place to be of like, I want off this ride. Like, if you're playing a video game, this is where we would unplug the console. Like, we're just going to go outside and play because it's not worth it. But this is life, and we can't unplug it. And I love preaching about good times and when things are going well, but the reality is it's in these fractured moments that the gospel saturates us. It's in these fractured moments where we're asking the question of what is going on that the gospel actually gets inside of us. And so I don't want to waste an opportunity to get a better grasp of who Jesus is. So just know, whenever you listen to this, that is the setting from which this sermon is going out. Time is a weird thing because the soil this sermon is produced in will still be relevant even when the soil changes. Luke 14 says this. Talks about when you want to build a watchtower, and this is not the point of the sermon, but we have to preface this, that Jesus is saying that when you get ready to build something, one of the things that you do in advance is you get this vision of the end. It says when you want to build something, you go back, underline the word first. First, you go down and you do what? You calculate the cost. What you're saying is, when I get to the finish line, what sort of sacrifices are going to be necessary between then and now? And Jesus is constantly speaking to this concept of the future. Going into the future, making a plan for the future, or making a plan for how you want to get where you want to go. And I think that's what we're saying is that right now we're in September of 2020. Thank God we're winding down on this year. But what we're saying is we didn't anticipate that the cost would be so high. It's not worth it. We don't even want a watchtower anymore. And so this series, we're going to be in this the next 4 weeks. The next 4 weeks, it comes from this place of saying, when our original worth it is gone, we just want peace. Well, peace is out the window. We just want comfort. Well, comfort is out the window. Where does our motivation come from? Where, when you're sitting here listening to this and things are kind of up in the air, where do you get your motivation to move forward when the thing that you originally placed value on as being worth it is gone? What a desperate place to feel as a person to go, I don't even know what I'm hoping for. We're in a series, it's going to be a 4-week series, and the title of the series is Worth It is Burning. How desperate as people we get when we feel like that our original reason, our original basis for beginning in the first place. Our original thought, it's burning. Now what do? Where do we derive motivation when the cost is higher than we anticipated? This whole series started from the question of what do you want? What do you want? As people, we can't answer that. We don't know what we want. We know what we want today, but we don't know what we want in the future. We can't anticipate what we're going to want tomorrow. We can give a short-term answer for what do you want. So based on this concept of what is worth it and what is the value and what do you want, the concept of life tells us, the Bible teaches us this, that in every goal, as you're looking into the future, as we're sitting here looking into the future and hoping that things are going to get better, we are hoping that from today things begin to get better. As we're making a goal, the reality is no goal is ever accomplished without a death and a resurrection. It's the concept of the word. It's the concept. When you go to the Bible is constantly teaching death and resurrection. I have this, and I'm going to put that into the ground as a sacrifice. I'm going to set down my comfort today as a plan or a goal for moving forward so that tomorrow will be better. That's what sacrifice is. And so if I were to say I really want to get in shape, my measurement is, is it worth going through the suffering in the gym? Apparently my answer is no. I want a healthy marriage. Everybody, I want a healthy marriage. That's what I want. I want a healthy marriage. That's going to include selflessness. There's a suffering. There's a death of self that has to be resurrected in a healthy marriage. You've got to set down self. You see what I mean? There's this constant theme. Children, anybody have kids? I think you get it. So when you go to Exodus, and here's where we're going to start. This is the theme of where we're going to be for a month, for the 4 series, and it's not going to be 4 weeks in a row, but for the next 4 weeks that I preach, it's going to be our worth it is burning. The children of Israel, they are slaves. They've been raised with a slave mentality, and so what God is going to do is he's going to perform this process. Now, you go, I thought the children of Israel crossed the desert. Yeah, kind of. But they zigzagged all over the place. Why? Because God was performing a transition. But for them to start, he had to give them, because they were slaves. He had to give them something that they said, that'll be worth it. Listen to this. In Exodus chapter 3, in the beginning, God tells them, and I promise that I'll bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt. And they're like, great, that's what we want. We want that too. So we agree. To the land of the Canaanites. Great. There's the promised land. Canaan is the promised land. The Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, all the ites. See, what he's telling them is there's going to be suffering. There's going to be a death and a resurrection in this process. I'm taking you to a land, but that land is already occupied. What is God telling his children? He's saying, I'm giving you a thought towards the future. I'm giving you a thought towards what you want, and it's going to be worth it. But he was warning them there's going to be suffering. But he ends the sentence with this, a land flowing with milk and honey. And you know what they got from that whole verse? The Jebusites, the Hittites, the Hivites, all that. You know what they heard? 3 words. Anybody ever have kids? If you'll clean your room, if you'll do the dishes, if you'll walk the dog, then I'll give you a sucker. What did they just hear? Sucker. All they heard, milk and honey, great, we're in. Comfort, great. A new life, a better life, great, we're in. Promised land was basically the concept of comfort, and they decided what? What did the children of Israel decide before they ever left in the desert? It's worth it. Can we real quick, before we get into the start of this nomadic adventure that they're going to go on, please understand that God is a dad who is rescuing his children out of the control of their oppressors. We say God and the children of Israel, but really scrap that. Think of it this way, that God has just rescued his children, and he's aware that they've gone through some trauma. He's aware of the fact that they don't think like children or family members. They don't think like members of a family. The children of Israel over decades and generations have developed a concept of slavery. They weren't just slaves on the outside. They'd become slaves on the inside. And as God rescues them, what he realizes is this is going to be a process. You're safe now. You're safe now. I've got you. But we're going to have to start working from slavery towards freedom. Listen to this in verse 17. You're going to see a very involved God who looks down and sees 2020 and goes, they're not doing very good. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. So what we instantly know is God wasn't just point A to point B here. God is engaged. He's going through this process. Remember, he's gonna lead them out of old and into new. And it says this. It says, for God said if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. It also says right there after that, so they went up ready for battle. Yeah. There's two things to consider when you're looking at someone who has a slave mentality, who has adopted a slave mentality. If you had been in slavery, if you had been enslaved in your life, there are two things that you would have to overcome. First is that you move away from struggle. Struggle or discomfort is something to immediately move away from. See, God said it's going to involve struggle. There's going to be death and resurrection. So part of the process is working through difficulty and working through struggle. But if you're a slave, you just move away from any struggle. And second one is you have no concept for the future. There's no concept in the mind of a slave for the future because they have no control over the future. Why would you make a plan for the future when you have no control over it? So these people are walking out of Egypt and they feel good because something's happening, but they are already ingrained in their mind that they want to move away from a struggle. Every struggle is bad. All discomfort is something to avoid, and never think about the future. That's what God's addressing. That is what God is trying to draw them out of. And if you're here and if you're listening now or later or in person or on a screen, then just know that the enemy is always dragging us back to those two things. That if it's uncomfortable, it's bad. And why even plan for the future? Let's do what's good for today. What the enemy is trying to do to us as people is drag us back into captivity. As slaves, they were constantly ready to sacrifice the future for a more comfortable present. Honestly, to be fair to them, I get it. Sometimes life does reach this level of difficulty or strife or suffering where it's like, I'm glad we don't have the option to go back to 2019 because none of us would be left. Like, I'm out, I'm done, or forward, whatever. Just get us out of right here. I get it. I at least understand the thought. I'm not defending it. I at least understand the thinking. I want to read you a quote. And I feel like I'm facing a mountain. I just want to be honest. If it feels like I'm kind of battling, I feel like I'm facing Everest on this concept because it's hard to put parameters around. So if you will, as a favor to me, try to understand where I'm going, even if I kind of have to bounce around. But the advantage that the Israelites had is there was a very clearly stated promised land. Even if they gave up, they at least knew what the intended worth it was, right? And we're dealing with a generation who was born already in the promised land. We don't struggle to get to the promised land. We struggle differently because we were born here. We don't even know what it is that we're working towards. We struggle to even clarify what is worth suffering in our own lives. We have my daughter, God love her. She got frustrated last night because she had to eat steak quesadillas. Like, we have first world problems. So please understand that this sermon is difficult because we're talking about slaves going to a geographic location. But as Americans, we are still working towards something, but we can't always clarify it. This is what C.S. Lewis said. C.S. Lewis said this. He says, I was at this time living like so many atheists or anti-theists. This is C.S. Lewis. In a whirl of contradictions, I maintained that God did not exist. I was also very angry with God for not existing. There is no God. But also angry of what kind of God would allow this. I'm mad that you don't exist. I'm mad that you're not there, and I'm mad that if you were there, you haven't fixed this, but I don't believe that you're there. This constant whirl of contradiction. But here's what he actually said. Please hear this part. He said, I was equally angry with him for creating a world. See, if you're wired to think that all suffering is bad, and there's suffering that you can't get away from, it's not long until eventually, due to suffering, we begin to resent that we exist at all. Isn't that a wild thought to think that we're just mad because we exist? It would have been better to never exist than to exist like this. Why? Because we've lost the concept of where we're going. That's what the Israelites were saying. We don't want to be in this desert. They didn't want to go back to Egypt. They just didn't want to be where they were. They were resenting that they existed in the first place. Listen, sacrifice is hard enough when you know what it's for. It's hard enough if you're trying to lose weight and you know that's your intended worth it sort of a concept. And it's hard enough if you know that. But what if you don't have any food and you don't know why? See, if you don't understand where it's going, then it's not a sacrifice. Now it's just torture. If we don't understand that God has a plan in 2020, God has a plan in the coronavirus and the fires and the suffering, if we don't understand that God has a plan, it feels like we just want this to end at any cost. Try to hear me on this. The present is a dangerous place for people with no vision for the future. It's a dangerous place. You don't want to live in the present with no concept of the future, because you'll begin leveraging away every advantage you've got to make yourself more comfortable today. What difference does it make? I don't even know where I'm going anyway. Genesis 25 says, once when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country, famished. And he said to Jacob, quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished. Jacob replied, first, sell me your birthright. I've heard this story. This should have been a no-brainer, because everything about the identity of Esau was wrapped up in this birthright, the lineage of Christ, his inheritance, the power of the family, his place in the family. All of this was wrapped up in a birthright. Jacob didn't just casually say, give me your birthright. He said, give me your identity. I'll give you what you want today, but give me your identity. It was a key element to his future and the stability of his family, his lineage, his inheritance, a future fortune. And Jacob said, sell me your reason for existence. It's kind of weird when you think of it that way, isn't it? Isn't that what the enemy says? You deserve to be comfortable today. I'll take you back to Egypt. Just give me the promised land. Give me the value of the future. It's slavery. It is slavery, and we see it demonstrated right here with Jacob and Esau. And Esau says, I don't even know why I exist in the first place. So what value is it of me? But the soup, it's here today. Look, I'm about to die, Esau said. What good is the birthright to me? Matthew Henry, it's a quote from Matthew Henry that says this. It says, the gratifying of the sensual appetite is that which ruins thousands of precious souls. A thought to the future, a thought of the future is what we survive on in moments of suffering. Anybody else ever felt that way? I don't know why I exist. I don't even love that I exist, but I certainly don't know why I exist. So what risk is there in giving up future benefit if it creates a better comfort for today? It's a slavery mindset. Jacob said, swear to me first. So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. Jordan Peterson calls it this. He says this. He says, Esau performed a reverse sacrifice. Can I say that again? What Esau did was he performed a reverse sacrifice that says, so that I don't have to suffer now, I will offer my future on the altar. You take my future, give me more comfort today. I'm going to jump to the New Testament real quick, because what we're trying to understand is what God is doing with his newly rescued children out of slavery. He has rescued his children out of slavery, and this verse right here begins to explain the process from Egypt to Canaan. Listen, in John chapter 8:35, it says, now a slave has no permanent place in the family, an inheritance. A slave has no future inheritance. A slave has no future place settled for him in the future. That's why a slave mentality says, I have to live for right now because I have no control over the future. And that's what John is saying, that a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. So if the son sets you free, the son, this is Jesus, if the son sets you free, you will be free indeed. And that's what God is doing. He starts the process. Eventually, it says that Esau wept out loud when he realized the magnitude of everything Jacob had tricked him out of. See, the future will someday make itself known. The Israelites, they were ruled by impulse. A son that sets you free indeed was a theme throughout the entire Bible. When we're suffering today, it's important to know that the theme of God's interaction is a grace that interferes. Nobody wants interference. But it's a grace that interferes. It's a grace that will put us into discomfort even against our own choosing. It is God's grace that will interfere with our comfort to create freedom. That's what grace is. The Israelites, they left Egypt totally ruled by impulse, totally removed from the concept of suffering as necessary, totally removed, completely unaware of the idea of a death and resurrection. They were literally people who could not see beyond their own toes. Could you say it this way? In the story of Esau, could you say it this way? That the Israelites were soup addicts? They didn't have anything, so they would give up everything. They never thought of themselves as having anything. They had a poverty mindset. We have soup today. Well, then take everything. I have nothing of value. Take it all. At least I have soup. It says that they left because the future was iffy anyway. They were constantly thinking, could we say it this way? This could almost be the title of the sermon. They were constantly trying to trade milk and honey for soup. It's difficult. Back to Egypt. Back to Egypt. Scared. Back to Egypt. Discomfort. Back to Egypt. Have you ever been to the airport? It's kind of a weird analogy, but the airport, they've got these tracks. It's like an escalator, but it doesn't go up or down. It just takes you there faster, and I always ride them. I don't understand people who are like, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to walk. Okay. But when it goes this way, and this one over here comes this way. So if you think of it in the desert, if you think of the desert between Egypt and Canaan, when it was going this way, it was going from slavery to freedom. And they were constantly wanting to jump on the one that took them from freedom back to slavery. The direction of which, what would you even call this? The track? Sounds kind of it's not a very creative word, but depending on which track you're on, it was like God was constantly urging them towards freedom, and they were constantly dragged back towards slavery. Freedom is tomorrow. Slavery says be comfortable today. Because they thought like slaves. See, the journey wasn't from Canaan to Canaan from Egypt. That was never the journey, proof of the fact that God took them all over the place. In fact, you could even say it this way, that what we see Esau doing when he trades his birthright, his inheritance, his sonship, is that Esau crossed the desert going the wrong direction. He didn't see the value of being a son. He didn't see the value of being free, and he sold it for slavery. He sacrificed the future in a reverse sacrifice to the benefit of today. Esau, as a son, had a slavery mindset. And he gave up all standing in the family. Let's try to make sense of it. I feel like I've been all over the place today, and I'm trying to. I feel so determined that this concept is right, and I also feel so challenged in being able to communicate it clearly. But what Exodus teaches us is this: is that God is an interested God. That the God of the universe, even in years like 2020, even when we're trying to find our way back to some semblance of normal, that even in years like that, even in times of suffering and struggling, even when what we had deemed worth it is gone, that God is an interested God. And he's not just interested, he's an involved Father. And he is constantly compelling us from our slavery mentality that we develop. See, because Esau was born wealthy. You look at the generation that we're living in today. We were born into the promised land, but we place no value on what we've been given. We are ready to burn down what we have, thinking that somehow it's going to get better, and God's going, wait. God is this interested and involved Father who is dragging us out of our slavery mindset into a family, into belonging, into an inheritance. I would say this way: it is better to exist in suffering than to have never existed. Because of what God tells us about himself, the nature that God expresses to us about himself in Exodus, is that even in the midst of suffering, young people especially hear me on this, because if we don't know that suffering is a necessary process, this death and this resurrection that brings us to a new place in life, if we don't know this, then when we face discomfort, we think we're getting life wrong. We think we're doing life wrong. We think that somebody else is doing it better. We think that it's not worth it. Maybe it would be better to have not existed. And what God is telling us, it is better to exist even in suffering than to not exist. And you go, how could you say that? because God saw it necessary to bring you into this world as a son, not as a slave. Can I tell you something that's going to just be really heartbreaking, but only for a short time? It's only for a short time. I'm going to tell you a truth that is hard at first, but then it's liberating. Happiness is unimportant. Yeah. I mean, that's not a very American thing to say because life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but happiness is not important. We all like it. We all enjoy it. But in January of 2020, we thought that happiness was the goal. We thought that happiness is what we were working towards. And what we're finding is happiness is kind of stupid. It comes and goes. Why? Even the things that made you happy when you were a little kid don't make you happy now. So the concept of happiness always is changing. You can't ever get to happy. Happiness is not an arrival point. Remember on Tombstone when Josephine's like, "Are you happy?" And Wyatt's like, "Huh?" That's a stupid question. Am I happy? I don't run around laughing like an idiot. Remember this? She's saying happiness is important, and Wyatt is going, "No, it's not. Nobility is important. Character, that's important. Facing adversity, that's what life is about. Life is about looking at a challenge and leaning into it and accepting the suffering and the difficulty and realizing that the stories of life are told through the death and the resurrection and the advancement through suffering. Happiness is stupid. Happiness is not a goal. It's a result of doing the other things correctly. Happiness is like that little blurry thing in your eye that you can only see when you don't look at it. I mean, happiness comes and goes, but when you place happiness as your highest priority, you are guaranteed to be unhappy. That's a liberating concept when you start to believe it. Because every time you face unhappiness, you go, well, that's not true north anyway. Happiness is not your true north. Nobody writes a movie about someone who's just happy. And then what? The movie's over. You're like, that's stupid. We're not inspired by happy. We're inspired by difficulty and triumph and adversity and character and nobility and all these things that have to do with choice. Choice. See, that's what a slave doesn't have. Slaves don't have choice. Children do. Choice in the midst of difficulties and in the midst of trials. That is what God was trying to teach. And proof is that as slaves, every time there was difficulty, they ran away from it. They ran away from it. They resented that they existed. They resented that God existed and didn't exist. If the only thing that you want out of life is to be comfortable today at any cost, soup is always for sale. There's always a soup salesman right around the corner offering you happiness today in exchange for your future. And it heads right back into slavery. You know, in all of Israel, 2 people that left Egypt entered Canaan. And it was the 2 that chose to believe in the future. Joshua and Caleb made the transition from slaves to children. He started to believe that God is good and that what God has for us will be good in the midst of all this suffering, in the midst of all this difficulty, that based on who God is, that it was never about Canaan anyway. It was about a concept that they couldn't grasp. And let me tell you something. There is nothing more rewarding in life than realizing that your original worth it burned, and it was replaced with a worth it that was better. See, God couldn't have convinced the Israelites to leave if he said, "I'm going to change your concept of worth it." They thought like slaves. They're like, "No, we'll just stay here." He had to dangle the carrot of Canaan, and they never got there. Joshua and Caleb took the concept of milk and honey as their standard or target of worth it, and they put it on the altar. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2. It says that this is Jesus. Fixing our eyes on Jesus. Isn't that what we're doing as a church? desiring more biblical literacy, understanding what the word is saying, that when we go there, we understand what's being taught. It says fixing our eyes on Jesus. That's what we're doing right now. That's why you're watching this online. That's why you're watching this in person. This is why we've come together personally to rub shoulders with each other and love each other and try to figure this life out. Why? Because when we can focus on Jesus, the suffering seems more worth it. That because of the goodness of God, that whatever we're enduring right now, that when we lay that on the altar of sacrifice and say it's worth it based on who Jesus is, that's what we're doing here. It says fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and the perfecter of our faith. So it's not you who perfects your faith, is it? Just working on my faith. It says that God is the perfecter of your faith. You focus on him. He does the heavy lifting. It says, for the joy set before him. It's an idea of the future. Jesus never thought like a slave. Jesus said, there is a goal, and it's worth it. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. What was his worth it? What was his worth it? What was the worth it that caused Jesus not to turn around in the desert and run back? You were. You were what Jesus thought of as worth it as he went to the cross. When I tell you it is worth it to exist, it is better that we exist even in suffering. It means that the God of the universe saw your life as so valuable he was willing to die for it. He didn't die so that you could remain in bondage. It says that he went to the cross and he deemed your life, your existence as worth it. Even in the midst of the struggling that we're facing, it's better that we exist. You know what 2020's proven? You know what I didn't know? I didn't know, my brother and I had this conversation, there are things that were just in stone. Tax day, April 15th, every year. It can never change. And then this year it's like, no, we're going to change it. And you're like, you can do that? Everything we thought was worth it burned. Everything that people placed value of, it's worth it, burned. And we've got this nation of people trying to balance, like, is it worth it to even exist? We want to quit, but we can't. We can't go back. We want to give up. Our worth it is burning. Like C.S. Lewis said, everything that we thought was worth the suffering, now we're going, the worth it is burning, but now there's suffering and there's difficulty and there's death, but we don't even understand the resurrection. Can I take the liberty to tell you what I would suggest as a worth it? You can do with it what you want, but can I offer you a thought? Philippians 1:6 says, being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you, let me tell you, God has you in a desert also. God is bringing you out of old sinful habits that think only of today. God is speaking life into your future. Jesus, based on what happened on the cross, is saying, think about your future. Think about the sacrifices that are necessary to get where I'm taking you. And you go, how do we know it's good? And he goes, because I'm good. Because I love you and I have begun a work in your life. Jesus has begun a good work in your life. And he doesn't need to give you the promised land, because the promised land, like I said, comes and goes. It says, I'm giving you a new concept of worth it. What does it mean to have something in life worth living for? And Jesus is going, that's the transformation that we're doing from slavery to freedom. It was never about the reward. It was about the process. He who began a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. God has better on the other side of this 2020 desert. You go, what about all the people suffering? Suffering is what it means to be alive. People, we're so spoiled. We think that all suffering is bad, and yet we see that when people suffer, they somehow, oftentimes, come out better than they were. Philosophers agree that suffering is the most real human experience. The suffering and difficulty gives us something to strive for. There's nothing that gives you a deeper appreciation for what you have than the moment that you lose it. And yet it's like we've been trained that in the midst of suffering, things are bad. And Jesus is going, that's the desert that you're crossing. That there's a future to look forward to. There's a future that's worth it. But I will tell you, everything that you thought was worth it before might burn in the process. Your worth it is burning. But he's given you a worth it now that's not based on a slavery concept that says, I don't think about the future because I have no control. And he's like, no. You have an inheritance now. You have a belonging and a family, and you go, well, what if I die? That's the best part. What if it never happens on this side of eternity? Imagine how much sweeter. Can I say this? Can we think of this? Imagine how much sweeter eternity is going to be for the people who suffer the most. Think of the deliverance heaven will be for people who suffered on this side. This death and this resurrection, that is part of the process. And God says, I'm giving you a new mindset. From slave to family. But there's some things that are going to have to burn in the meantime. Don't trade the future for a bowl of soup today. It is better that you exist. Life is better having been lived through suffering than to have never existed at all. Let's pray. No possible way, God, do we grasp all this yet. God, over the next 4 sermons, help us to understand that the desert was so necessary, God, because if you would have just put them in the promised land, they would have sold it for a bowl of soup. God, they had to change before they could move into their destiny. They had to transform. They had to transition from slaves to children before they were able to live in the place that you'd created for them. God, give us a thought for the future. Lord, even if we don't have what we want nailed exactly right, it says that you are so faithful to stick with it and clarify it and purify it until we get it figured out. God, the pressure is not to guess correctly. God, the future is based on your goodness, that you are a good God, and based on your love and your involvement, that the future is worth it. It is worth leaning into. And God, the idea that somehow we represented your joy, that you somehow thought that we were worth it. God, may we try to wrestle with that and begin to understand even a glimpse of the love that you have for us. That the future is worth it. Amen.